The arrival of the American Second Fleet to the Middle East and its entry into the Arabian Sea, an unprecedented American airlift to Jordan, America ordering its nationals to leave Iran immediately, and Iran announcing the entry into service of a new ballistic missile capable of overturning the entire balance of power equation. All this while negotiations are being conducted in Oman directly between the two countries. In breathtaking moments, the whole world is asking one question: is America using negotiations to buy time until military preparations for a military strike are complete, or is it using this massive military buildup for political pressure to win the negotiations? We are facing a very complex scene that has begun to take shape clearly in the first weeks of 2026. The story begins when we focus on the details that occurred between late January and February 9th, 2026, which reveal that we are not facing random events, but rather a plan arranged with precision. In Jordan, specifically at Muwafaq al-Salti Air Base, commercial satellites detected unprecedented air transport activity. C-17 and even C-5M aircraft. These are giant planes transporting heavy equipment and cargo, suggesting the base is transforming from merely a support point to an advanced operations base, ready for engagement at high intensity. In parallel with this, the deployment of F-15E Strike Eagle aircraft and Patriot missile batteries was observed, giving the impression that a missile shield is being built to neutralize any Iranian reaction. On the naval front, the scene is no less dramatic. The aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln arrived in the Arabian Sea, but this time not alone. It's moving with U.S. Coast Guard ships. This is a very strange integration in naval military doctrine, indicating a clear intention to impose a naval blockade and economic strangulation through inspection and confiscation operations, not just traditional power projection. Amid this terrifying military buildup comes the diplomatic scene in Muscat on February 6th, when delegations sat to negotiate at the Al Gharib Palace. What's strange is that the American delegation wasn't just diplomatic. It included Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of Central Naval Forces, sitting in his military uniform at the negotiating table in a clear message to the Iranian negotiator that force is ready for immediate implementation. On the same day, while soft talk was happening in Muscat, an American C-17 military transport plane was landing at Yerevan Airport in Armenia on an emergency evacuation mission as Washington was packing its bags for a scenario of negotiations collapsing at any moment. This dramatic scene was completed by a suspicious event in the heart of Tehran on the night of negotiations, when a massive fire broke out at the headquarters of the Iranian Army's Joint Chiefs of Staff. Although the official Iranian narrative tried to contain the matter and say it was an electrical short circuit, the timing of the fire with the ongoing negotiations and military buildup raises major questions about a third secret track operating in the background. All this puts us before a strategy of maximum balanced pressure, using announcements of movements as a deterrent tool and placing Tehran between two choices, harder than each other at a very critical time. Here we ask our questions. Why is Muwafaq al-Salti base in Jordan specifically transforming into a terrifying offensive military position in just 1 week? What does it mean for a nuclear aircraft carrier to move with small Coast Guard ships in the heart of the Arabian Sea? How does the American fleet commander in his military uniform sit facing diplomats at a soft political negotiating table? And suddenly, why does a military evacuation plane rush to Armenia at the exact moment of negotiations? What are they afraid of? And then, is it a coincidence that the headquarters of the Iranian Army Command catches fire mysteriously on this same ominous night? Let's break down this scene piece by piece. And as usual, sources are in the comments for those who want more extensive details. To understand what happened in Muscat and the naval maneuvers, we need to rewind a bit, specifically to the third week of January 2026, and look at the ground in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, because what happened there was the foundation for everything that came after. The story began with a massive logistical operation whose goal was to build a defensive wall to neutralize Iran's most important pressure card, its ballistic missile arsenal. This had to happen before any diplomat set foot in the Sultanate of Oman. The whole story centered on Muwafaq al-Salti Air Base in the Azraq area. This base, which had always played a quiet and pivotal role as an operations center for the coalition, but images captured by Maxar Vision commercial satellites in late January revealed that the base's function had changed 180 degrees. It transformed from merely a support point to a primary forward operations base ready for heavy war. Activity there was like a beehive. In the period from January 18 to 26, meaning in just 8 days, about 42 heavy military transport flights landing at the base were detected. The main star in this airlift was the C-17 Globemaster aircraft, which can carry 77,000 kilos of cargo and land on runways that aren't fully equipped. But what was really interesting was the appearance of the C-5M Super Galaxy aircraft. This is the largest aircraft in the entire American inventory. So why are the Americans sending the beast C-5M specifically amid the rush of C-17s? The answer here reveals the nature of the equipment being transported. The C-5M is designated for transporting extraordinary loads that the C-17 cannot handle, such as main battle tanks, heavy engineering bridges, and most importantly, the massive missile defense radars necessary to cover the theater of operations. These flights weren't coming from just anywhere. They were coming from pivotal logistical centers like Ramstein Air Base in Germany and Fort Sill in the United States. And when we know that Fort Sill is the Artillery and Patriot Missile Crew Training Center, the picture becomes clearer. These shipments were missile batteries and very advanced air defense equipment. On January 22nd, satellite imagery revealed the arrival of F-15E Strike Eagle aircraft to Muwafaq al-Salti base as well. This aircraft isn't just an air superiority fighter. It's a long-range bomber carrying extra fuel tanks and a terrifying weapons load. In a crisis like this, the F-15 has two roles. First, it's an explicit offensive threat against Iranian assets and its allies in Iraq and Syria. The second role is that it works as a cruise missile loader for defense, meaning it can hunt drones and cruise missiles that fly and might escape ground radars. Here a question imposes itself strongly. Why is the American military parking very expensive and important planes like these in an open, exposed yard instead of putting them in fortified shelters and bunkers? The reason simply is visible deterrence. The Americans intended for commercial satellites to photograph these planes ready for combat, so the message reaches the heart of Iran. We are ready and prepared. But what happened after that was much more dangerous, because while air forces were securing the sky from above Jordan, the American Navy and Coast Guard forces were executing a parallel operation at sea. This operation aimed to strangle Iran's economic lifeline and cut supply lines to its proxies, and it reached its climax with a power display of very high symbolism on the same day of negotiations. On February 6th, in conjunction with the talks taking place in Muscat, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, released official photos of the carrier strike group sailing in a strange combat formation, and they wrote on it the comment, "Peace through strength." This is a very intentional invocation of the Reagan-era doctrine that said overwhelming military superiority is the basic condition for diplomacy to succeed. These photos weren't a souvenir shot at all. They were photographing aircraft from Carrier Air Wing 9 executing flight operations over the formation, meaning the carrier's deck was hot and planes were taking off and landing, indicating the carrier is in a ready combat posture, not just a transit posture. This message was specifically addressed to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard so they could see with their own eyes that their coastal infrastructure and naval assets have come under American fire. But the point that really stopped and puzzled analysts in this February 6 formation was the presence of two U.S. Coast Guard ships moving alongside the carrier and its supply ships. So what would make Coast Guard ships, whose basic function is policing, move shoulder to shoulder with a nuclear aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean? The secret here is in changing the combat doctrine. Usually carrier strike groups are protected by destroyers and guided missile frigates designated for major wars like war against aircraft and submarines, and rarely do we see Coast Guard integrating into combat formations on the high seas. But Coast Guard ships operating with patrol forces in Southwest Asia possess unique legal authorities not found in regular warships because they're designed for visit, board, search, and seizure operations. Their presence here gives a very important signal: maritime interdiction. The strategic meaning of this is that America was preparing itself to impose a quarantine or an aggressive inspection regime on commercial ships leaving or entering Iranian ports. This capability targets traffic in the gray zone like sailing boats and small cargo ships that the Revolutionary Guard usually uses to smuggle missile components to proxies like the Houthis in Yemen. The big difference: a destroyer is a war tool, but a Coast Guard ship is a law enforcement and strangulation tool. Their presence next to the carrier was saying that America is ready to strangle Iran's external logistics without necessarily having to start a comprehensive war. But the coming moment changed all calculations, because after the military chessboard was arranged perfectly and the sky became protected by Patriots and the sea secured by the aircraft carrier, all eyes turned on Friday, February 6, 2026 to the Omani capital, Muscat. These negotiations were historic, not just because of their sensitive timing and importance, but because of the strange way military threat merged with diplomatic work. Oman, which has always played the role of the Switzerland of the Middle East, hosted the delegations at Al Alam Al Amer Palace, but in an indirect system to avoid any political embarrassment or direct handshake. The American delegation sat in one room and the Iranian delegation in another room, and it was Omani Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi who played the mediator role, going back and forth between the two rooms, carrying messages and proposals himself. This allowed both parties to speak in depth without having to acknowledge each other before public opinion. Here we must ask, what makes the composition of the American delegation this time break all known diplomatic protocols and shock observers? The answer appears when we look at the faces of people sitting at the table. The delegation was led by Special Envoy Steve Woodcock, and with him Chief Advisor Jared Kushner, but the real surprise was the presence of Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of U.S. Central Naval Forces, who entered the negotiation hall wearing his full official military uniform. So here's an important question. What makes a military general sit among diplomats in negotiations that are supposed to be political? Admiral Cooper's presence wasn't a coincidence. It was a tangible, concrete reminder of the fleet anchored at sea just a few kilometers away. Cooper represented the operational capability that would execute threats if talk failed. His presence forced Iranian diplomats to look into the eyes of the commander whose forces would strike them if they didn't reach a solution. Inside the closed rooms, the talk revealed a deep strategic gap between the two powers. The Americans entered with a maximum position and demanded a comprehensive agreement that completely ends Iran's ballistic missile program and stops support for proxies in the region, because after the 12-day war, Washington began seeing these missiles as an existential threat exactly like the nuclear one. On the other side, the Iranian delegation led by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi came with clear instructions to separate the files and emphasized that these missiles are a red line and not subject to negotiation because they are a defensive deterrent. They focused all their talk on lifting sanctions and the peacefulness of the nuclear program. Despite this fundamental difference, the result came out in a very calculated manner. Both parties described the talks as a good start, and the Omani minister described the sessions as very serious and useful, and they agreed to meet again at the appropriate time. This was purely a tactical success that prevented the collapse of dialogue at that moment and bought some time for both parties to recalculate. But behind the scenes, the game was completely different, because at the time diplomats were distributing smiles and optimism in Muscat, military planners were executing a contingency plan that reveals they see a dark picture of the situation. On the same day of talks, February 6, 2026, America activated an evacuation corridor through the South Caucasus and was preparing for a terrifying scenario, that negotiations collapse and turn into immediate chaos. The story began with flight tracking data that recorded a very specific and suspicious mission for an American C-17E Globemaster III military cargo plane. This plane took off from Ramstein Air Base in Germany and landed at Yerevan Airport, the capital of Armenia. What's interesting about this is that this plane had just come from Dover Air Force Base in the United States and arrived in Germany the day before, which means there was a direct and urgent assignment issued from American Transport Command to execute this mission, which intelligence reports clearly say is an evacuation operation for American citizens from Iran via Armenia. The most important question here: why specifically Armenia to be the chosen escape point among all the countries around Iran? The answer here has very precise geopolitical calculations, because Armenia shares a southern border with Iran, and at the same time, during crises when Iranian airspace is closed or becomes a conflict zone, the land route to Armenia becomes one of the very few safe exits available for civilians. The borders with Iraq and Afghanistan are considered conflict zones and completely unsafe. The borders with Turkey have complex political calculations. As for the sea route, it was completely closed due to the naval blockade and confrontation imposed by the American aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln. That's why Armenia, with its unique position and good relations with both Tehran and Washington at the same time, was able to play the role of a neutral humanitarian decompression chamber. Reports confirmed that it wasn't limited to America only, because India also used the same corridor on the same day to evacuate its citizens, and even Azerbaijan temporarily opened its borders for passage. This confirms we're not facing an ordinary exodus. We're facing a large-scale mass exodus of foreigners. So why is America sending a tactical military plane like the C-17 for a mission like this instead of chartering an ordinary civilian plane? The use of the C-17 specifically confirms the classification of this operation as high risk. These aircraft are equipped with defensive systems and anti-missile countermeasures like heat flares and metal chaff, and can operate in hostile and unsafe environments. This reveals that American military planners were taking into account the possibility that peace talks could turn into war within hours, and they had to have immediate capability to extract important figures or even deal with medical casualties if things got out of control. But away from these scenes, there was something else bigger cooking. At the moment the negotiation day was ending, and the American evacuation plane was still standing on the airport ground in Armenia, there was a mysterious kinetic event happening in the heart of the Iranian capital, Tehran itself, to add a new and terrifying layer of secret instability to the entire crisis. The story happened late on the night of Friday, February 6th, and extended into the early hours of Saturday morning, February 7th, when a massive fire broke out in a sensitive military installation in eastern Tehran. The target that caught fire wasn't an ordinary building or even an ordinary military building. It was connected to the headquarters of the Iranian Army's Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're talking here about the central nervous system of conventional military forces, meaning the place precisely responsible for coordinating missile movement and ground forces that were already the core issue and focus of talk and dispute in the negotiations in the Omani capital, Muscat. The important and very dangerous question here that strongly imposes itself: is it conceivable that this is just a coincidence that the place managing missiles burns at the exact moment they're negotiating about the fate of these missiles? In the language of strategic analysis and probability, the idea that a random industrial accident occurs in a strategic command node like this at this precise sensitive timing is a statistically almost nil probability. The timing says this was an intentional and arranged incident. Why? Let's say the official Iranian media, IRNA agency, and army officials moved very quickly to control the narrative and contain the matter. They issued a statement saying the fire was caused by merely an electrical short circuit that occurred in a carpentry workshop located inside the complex, and they strongly denied any casualties. This explanation isn't new. It goes with a long-known pattern of Iranian cover-up and evasion when sabotage operations like this target sensitive sites, just as they used to call explosions of centrifuge devices in Natanz industrial accidents. But on the ground, the signals were saying the complete opposite. Social media was flooded with news and rumors about hearing explosion sounds, and even senior police officers, when they spoke on condition of anonymity, refused to rule out the hypothesis of sabotage or deliberate arson. So what message could reach Tehran from a fire like this amid peace talks when negotiators haven't even gone home yet? When diplomats talk in Oman and the Navy circles in the Gulf, this fire was indicating activation of the third secret track. Whether this operation was executed by American cyber capabilities or agents of the occupation army or even internal opposition, the result is one. This is a very powerful psychological function, proving to Iranian leadership that their physical and internal security is penetrated and exposed. This incident happened while the country was already boiling with protests from everywhere. Suddenly, the fire in a military headquarters to give a signal of internal weakness and the possibility of splits or penetrations inside the security apparatuses themselves. For American negotiations, the smoke that rose from the General Staff headquarters in Tehran was strengthening their position at the table because it conveyed a feeling that the Iranian regime is besieged not just by the fleet at sea, but also from inside its own home. In the end, when we put these 5 scenes together side by side, the logistical buildup in Jordan, the strange sea blockade, Muscat's cautious handshakes, Yerevan's escape, and Tehran's mysterious fire, the complete picture appears terrifyingly. We're not here facing a group of coincidences. We're facing the implementation of the maximum pressure strategy in its fiercest form. America put the Iranian regime in a strategic grip with no escape. If they think of using missiles as a pressure tool, the sky is closed and completely neutralized by Patriot batteries and F-15 aircraft in Jordan. If they try to rely on smuggling or the economy, the sea is strangled by Coast Guard forces blockading ports with the aircraft carrier. Even while sitting in their homes, fire ignites in their headquarters and fears of internal collapse increase. All this pressure had one goal only: to force them to sit at the table and choose the diplomatic emergency exit in Muscat instead of military suicide. But the truth we must understand well is that the 12-day war that passed didn't end the conflict between Washington and Tehran. It only changed the shape of the field and the rules of the game. We have officially entered the era of hybrid warfare, the phase where diplomatic peace is tied by a very thin wire to a military cargo plane over Armenia and a radar signal in the Jordanian desert. The peace they came out with from Muscat is very fragile peace, standing on a hair and backed only by the brutal military force filling the region and waiting for a small mistake for the entire region to ignite. If you're interested in military matters, the latest weapons and war plans, the world of espionage and intelligence tactics, war backstories, and latest developments, you're in the right place. Kafaya with Ahmed Mubarak, the largest political and military platform in the Middle East. Subscribe now to the channel from here and join millions of followers.